Hello, welcome back to Geek Warning. This week we've got a very, very special episode, one that has perhaps feels like it's been months in the making. I'm Dave Rome, but really you won't be hearing much of me. Rather, Ronan, what do you have for us?
Today, Dave, I'm taking a look at why our cycling kit is getting so expensive and why we can now pay up to 250, 300 euro for a pair of bibs, and breaking down just exactly what does go into that pricing, trying to figure out if those high-end bibs are stitched with marginal gains or if it's all just pure margins. And we've got a guest along with us to discuss that. That is Steve Smith of Castelli. And yes, it does feel like it's been months in the making because I recorded this episode, I think, in the middle of March or something. So it's been a while ago that we recorded this. Getting into written words has taken a bit longer.
Sure. People who have been following Geek Warning for a little while now may remember, I'd say the start of last year, we did an episode with Rob Gatellis of Factor, where you and Rob broke down the costs of bikes and sort of where all the expenses add up and how a bike comes to be as expensive as it is by the time someone buys it. Very, very popular special episode of that. What you covered in that ended up giving fodder for various other media outlets and YouTube creators to create conversations and spin their own content out of. But I guess we're back, and it's very much that same theme, but this time it's clothing. And I guess it's probably worth, before we get into it, just really saying why we picked Castelli. What are some of the things that make Castelli uniquely placed to discuss this?
They're one of the biggest manufacturers, and when combined with Sportful in the cycling space, they probably are, if not the biggest, certainly close to it. And there's pros and cons to selecting a manufacturer like that or working with a manufacturer like that for this piece, in that they will have access to economies of scale that many other brands simply don't. So it's not that's perhaps not the fairest comparison. But being so big, they have like dozens of facilities in Europe, in Asia. They have manufacturing facilities that they own. They have ones that they contract, and so there's a kind of a unique insight into the manufacturing element of it. And then we look at the cost of materials and manufacturing, and we get into X factory cost, which is basically like when it's leaving the factory, what kind of price are we talking about that, or what type of cost are we looking at so far, and then we start getting into everything from shipping and insurance to tariffs and retailer margins, distributor margins, and then that kind of gets us into our one of the other key reasons why Castelli made sense for this piece is that Castelli actually operates a bit of a hybrid model in that they do have a traditional distribution network through retailers, but they also have an online store direct to consumer, and they also have bricks and mortar shops, Castelli shops in Girona and Berlin and potentially others as well. And so they kind of work in all of the spaces that we would have otherwise been going here, there and everywhere trying to get speaking to sources who would share such information, which again, the same as the Factor and Rob Gatellis piece, the number of people who see the value in speaking as openly as we have done in both these podcasts and both these articles is extremely limited. And so just like we thanked Rob last year, we do have to thank Steve this year for being as open as he was.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we're going to jump into that episode, but I think it is worth noting that unlike some things we publish on the Geek Warning channel, this one takes more of the slants of Your Performance Process podcast, where it is largely for members of Escape Collective. So we'll give just a tease, just a taste for those on the free feed of Geek Warning. But as we say every week, you're missing out by not being a member of Escape Collective. And hopefully this is just yet another example of that, because you spoke about all the manufacturing costs and all the clothing costs and how Castelli is so uniquely placed for that. But you actually did get into things about like marketing and testing costs and how they use World Tour teams for testing, and even how why Steve thinks that some brands are about to kill gravel, which I thought was quite interesting. So I think there's a lot here, but
At one point I asked him how much of the expense of taking myself and a group of other journalists to Girona to present us with a new product do my parents pay for when they're getting new bib shorts?
Yeah. So anyway, I was just merely a listener to this one, and I found it fascinating. So yeah, let's not waste any more time. Let's jump into it.
You've probably noticed that cycling kit has gotten more expensive in recent years. A high-end pair of bib shorts now costs more than my first road bike, a Trek 1000, did in 2003. At the same time, you can pick up a full jersey and bib shorts on Temu, AliExpress, or any of these other platforms for the price of a cafe stop. So what gives? What are we actually paying for when we buy premium cycling clothing? Why does it cost so much? And are we being fleeced? Today I'm joined by Steve Smith, brand manager at Castelli, one of the most recognisable names in high performance cycling apparel. Steve has been with Castelli since 1997 and has helped shape their reputation for innovation, world tour partnerships and cutting edge performance kit. We're going to break down the real costs behind these prices. Steve, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us here today.
Thanks, Ronan. Happy to be here.
Before we get cracking, appreciate you for joining the show here today. This is sort of a follow-on to an episode we did last year with Rob Giteles of Factor Bikes, exploring why modern bikes cost so much, and I think that was exceptionally insightful from Rob. It was, though, the perspective of one brand, and today it's going to be a similar case. You're here speaking on behalf of two brands, actually, Castelli and Sportful, but it is a unique perspective, a single perspective. Others will differ within the industry, but nevertheless, we appreciate the insight you're about to share with us. Before we delve into dollars and cents and euros and pennies, Steve, can you maybe start just by giving us a little background? Most of our listeners, I'm sure, will know of Castelli, the Scorpion logo and all that, but maybe give us a little insight, like how big is Castelli?
Yeah, so Castelli and Sportful together, we do about 3 million garments a year. So in the cycling world, that's a lot. If we compare it to some of the bigger brands, I mean, I can't even imagine what Nike or Adidas would do, or even Zara, these kind of brands. So, it's a big enough level that we're at very much an industrial scale, but still in a niche sport.
Do you have any idea how that would compare within the industry? Are you in the top 1%, the middle 50%?
Yeah, I think there's only 3 or 4 brands that are anywhere close to that total level.
Okay, and that will obviously impact what we're about to discuss. Also, you're working in scales that other manufacturers, very few will operate in, I guess. Can you put a turnover figure on the two brands, or?
Yeah, so the two brands together are close to 100 million euros in turnover.
And yeah, you mentioned a couple of brands like Zara, Adidas, those sorts of brands. Just like if listeners want to consider how we compare here to the broader, not so much technical clothing, but fashion industry, is that minute or is it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I would guess that they're into probably hundreds of millions of pieces for sure. Yeah.
Understandable, but still good to get a perspective on this, because again, all these things are interconnected and feed into each other. The other thing before we get into your specific operations is just inflation and the changing costs. Let's be real, it's not just cycling kit that's more expensive. Everything is these days. But from your understanding, has cycling kit gone up in line with inflation, or has it outpaced it, or how are we looking?
Yeah, I would say it's roughly mirrored inflation in terms of total costs. The raw materials cost has probably tracked quite closely to inflation. There's quite a bit of transport involved that's been a little bit more than inflation. And then also labor has definitely gone up. We produce a majority of our products in Eastern Europe, where labor is really skyrocketed. Asia, at different levels, it seems like it's a little bit more constant, but then, there you're also involved with currency fluctuations.
In researching this episode, I used the Wayback Machine, the website where you can view websites from whenever in history that they've got a recording of it. And I looked up a 2004 pair of Castelli Efuso bib shorts from 2005, sorry, and then used an inflation calculator to compare them to today. Those bibs back then were £80, and my local online dealer, who having to work for a while as well. Today, that is about £180 according to this calculator that I used that was using UK inflation rates. I don't know what level the Efuso bibs were at, but I suspect they were probably premium back then given that pricing. Compare that to today, the Castelli Espresso bibs are 175, and so that seems in line. But then you've got the Premio Evo, which are like £300.
Yeah.
How does all that line up? Can we make comparisons there?
Yeah, actually, I would say that the espresso short today is actually more comfortable, almost a better short than the white Fuso. The Premio short uses some technology that was, not even imagined back in 2004. So it's a little bit like our road bikes, right? I mean, you take a fairly standard carbon frame today with 105 stuff on it, and it's better than your top of the line things from back in 2004, and actually costs less.
We're not really, especially on bikes now, we're not really comparing apples for apples. There's apples, oranges, there's all sorts on there. And even just looking at the image that the Wayback Machine had from this website of the Waifusos, night and day difference just from the image alone.
Yep.
I mean, there's also, in recent times, there's seemingly the COVID effect. We've all experienced, retail prices, go through the roof in that period. How much have your material and labor costs increased in the past 5 years?
Yeah. So the COVID effect, as it applies to fabrics, during the COVID boom, all of the suppliers they realized they had a little bit more price flexibility, but, as the COVID correction came along, the farther back you were in the supply chain, the more you got hit because shops were full, distributors were full, we were full. We had fabrics already in the warehouse, so the whole supply chain was kind of filled up, and so it was really the fabric suppliers and the factories that got hit pretty hard with the drop in production. Because I think we're typical to the industry. At one point, we had 4 times our normal inventory in the warehouse, and so we actually sold stuff over a year and a half that was already in the warehouse. So our production dropped off quite a bit. And so that the lack of demand kept the pricing on the fabrics a little bit in check, but yet on the labor side, we're competing with other sectors for manual labor. And so the cost of labor has gone up quite a bit. So that's a bigger impact into the products, into the inflation that we see.
I mean, when you're talking about that there, I'm thinking that could go two ways. If there's so much supply, prices, supply and demand, economics and all that, prices need to come down to move it on. But then if you're having to store all this extra materials and that could be driving prices up. What actually happened there? Is it normalizing yet? Is this just a new normal and it's never going to normalize?
By mid of last year, we got into normal levels with inventory. So, and fortunately, through a lot of the time that we had to finance the inventory, the cost of financing was quite low. So that didn't have a huge effect on it. And, fortunately we were able to move through that product without really having to affect margin too much. So it wasn't a fun time, but, looking back on it, I think we got through it fairly well. But, the overall, because there was so much product in the marketplace, the overall industry, cycling apparel, but cycling in general kind of went on sale. Kind of everybody through the chain, from retailers, distributors, manufacturers, we all tightened the belts a little bit on margin.
Was that just across the board, or are like certain categories or price points that were more or less affected by all that?
Yeah. So, the high end kind of held on the whole time. It's that kind of middle and lower end, that suffered a bit more, but I think that's partly because the early part of COVID, that was the part that was really booming. And so, everybody kind of loaded up on that mid-range product. And so when it slowed down, that's what was most filling up in the warehouses and in the stores.
Well, yeah. Hopefully you're right. It sounds like you're saying we're beyond that now. There are new headwinds, so to speak, that we'll no doubt have to get into here today as well. And inflation is just an ongoing reality, always will be. But I feel like quite often how brands respond to those sort of challenges quite often shows their priorities, and whether that's trimming margins or trimming features or whatever. But I want to kind of move us on and get us into where does the money go? And if we start with the basics, Steve, if we take a top tier pair of bib shorts, can you break down these into like individual components, individual raw materials, and maybe even getting into raw material cost per item if we can?
Yeah. So just looking specifically at a high-end bib short. So you do have the kind of big major areas that affect it are obviously all your fabrics and components, the physical part of the short, and then a big part is also labor, because every single cycling garment you buy is made by hand. Mm-hmm. There isn't really much machine making here, except for like knit. Socks are obviously coming out of a knitting machine, but the labor is a significant component. And then we factor when we evaluate the cost of the product, we also load in all of those non-direct costs. So all the product development, sampling, the time of the pattern engineer, the R&D that we do, kind of lumping all of those costs in, and it adds, that's roughly an extra 20% on top of the materials and labor costs. And then that gets you basically to the actual cost of the product. And then, from the time of the actual cost of the product to getting it to the consumer, there's all of the part of transport, retail markup, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later, talking about different online channels and offline channels and what those cost. But looking more specifically just at the cost of the product, you've got a fabric cost in a pair of shorts, let's say, except for the stuff like you mentioned on Temu, but your cheapest fabrics will cost around 4.5 to 5 euros per meter, and you use about a half of a meter in a pair of shorts. Mm-hmm. But then you'll go up to fabrics that will cost up to 25 euros per meter. Mm. So it's a really big range between the low end and the super high end. And then chamois, I think I'm not exactly sure about this number because we've never actually looked at this, but I think you could probably find a chamois out there from somebody for under €1. But that price, you can also spend up to 15 euros for a chamois. So again, there's a very, very wide range. And then all the other components that go onto it, all the trims and embellishment. And, we mentioned earlier about like as inflation goes up, we actually trim features on it, but the market cyclists are actually demanding more features. So it's almost like in adding to the inflation we're adding more and more features to it, beyond just the pure fabric and chamois and basics.
And so, like, similar question that I put to Rob last year in terms of producing a carbon frame. We've all heard someone say, "Oh, they make these shorts for pennies or a couple of euro or whatever," and then is that true? Could it be true?
It's pretty hard to imagine it because a lot of the inputs, the nylon and lycra, these are really commodity goods that have a certain price, and you still have to, wherever you're making them, you have to knit these fabrics. So to just get to the base fabric is getting to some level, but there's ways of doing that a little bit cheaper. But to make a high quality product is actually, when you're using state of the art technologies and materials, it actually does get quite expensive.
There's also, as I understand it, and like I was a sales rep for Pactimo at one point in Ireland, so I've got a little bit of understanding of all this. But there are ways that you can assemble jerseys and shorts that increase durability, let's say. And I'm wondering, do they add cost? I'm thinking like things like triple lock stitching and like even maybe not durability, but flat lock stitching, which became the sort of fashion trend for a while. Do those sorts of things add cost, or is having someone stitch it up going to cost the same regardless of what they're doing?
Yeah, actually, it's a good example. Flat lock stitching at one point was not quite a new technology, but it was the way the machines worked were a little bit slower to actually do the assembly. And
can you maybe just explain it for listeners who aren't familiar with? Yeah.
So flat lock stitch is where you're laying the one layer of fabric directly over the other layer of fabric, and you kind of stitch through them so that when you feel that in the hand, you don't feel a thick seam that you would get from a surged seam or an overlock seam. And so on the body, it's gonna feel a little bit more comfortable. When you take the shorts off, you don't have that indent of where the seam was. So some of those things can have a slight impact on the price, but over time, as you've got more machinery, and actually machinery improved to do that flat lock stitching a little bit faster. So that doesn't really impact a lot. But just another good example of where the higher quality can cost a lot more is a cheaper short will use a thicker yarn. And with a thicker yarn, you can produce the yarn itself costs much less. And then the actual knitting of the fabric is much, much faster. So to go to a smaller yarn, which makes it more soft and more comfortable, increases both the cost of the yarn, but also the amount of time on the expensive knitting machine to actually make the fabric.
Again, just for listeners who aren't aware, like yarn, is that just a material, or what are you talking about there?
Yeah, so the fabric is obviously made up of individual fibers that are grouped together to make yarns, and then either knit or woven into the fabric. And yeah, through at a mill that is going to create the fabric to the specs of what we need. And so the standard nylon or polyester fibers are a little bit more of a commodity product. And then normally you're mixing it with in cycling clothing. Quite often we're using an elastane or spandex, which there's all kinds of grades of quality there that differ dramatically in cost. So to use a better spandex, it'll be more durable and give more compression to the short. It's going to drive up the cost. And the more you use, it's the spandex that actually is quite expensive in the short as well. So that'll drive up the cost as you use more spandex.
Is that why, we can pick up different pairs of bibs even from one manufacturer, or comparing different manufacturers, and they have a different weight to them and a different feel when you're wearing them, and different compression rate and different softness versus hardness and breathability and all that? Is that where all that comes in?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Does that, I think you already said that does add cost, how you balance that?
Yeah, in fact, a short that you like from Castelli, that espresso short, that one uses a really premium level of nylon yarn with a fairly high level of lycra. It comes out just absolutely soft. But in this case, we've since that short is made to be the short, you just kind of want to keep pulling out of the drawer every day. The big focus is on comfort, so we actually made it with a little bit less compression. So it's not just the material that goes into it, but it's also how it's knit together that will affect the compression and how it feels on the body. But the focus on that was we wanted that to the immediate comfort to be something you feel just kind of when you're pulling it on, about the time it passes your knees should be when you start to feel the comfort of that.
Well, yeah, we have our collective favorites series on Escape Collective, which is not a buyer's guide in any way. It's just our own personal favorites across a range of products and that. And yes, I selected the espressos as my go-to at the moment for that very reason, the softness and the comfort. But yeah, that's sort of reflected in the price as well, is what you're saying. Mm-hmm. It doesn't come for free.
Yeah, but then on that short, because the fabric just works so well. If you look at the rest of the short, partly as a design that we wanted to keep it really clean and simple, but the aspects that affect the cost is, again, materials and then the labor. So that one has a little bit less labor to it, but we put more money into the materials, so it came out as a great value there at 160 euros.
I mean, there are other components to a pair of bibs that you haven't touched on yet. I'm thinking like bib straps and leg grippers and those sorts of elements. What are we looking at for those? Have you got a range?
Yeah, so leg grippers are kind of all over the board, but it's almost become, in a lot of cases, you see people looking at leg grippers before they look at the chamois now, because most chamois are pretty good. I mean, occasionally you get a bad one, but a few years back, everybody looked at the chamois and the rest didn't really matter as much. But leg grippers are crazy. A cheap leg gripper can be as little as €1 per pair of shorts in terms of actual cost. And then it goes up again, orders of magnitude.
And is that when you get into like just a standard silicone gripper versus a laser etched compression, not laser etched, but laser cut compression band and these sorts of variances? Yeah.
And so, there's a million ways to make a leg gripper. And so, you can kind of go nuts with the cost on that. So yeah, all told, it's pretty easy to get up for, the actual manufacturing the cost of a short to be up well north of 50 euros on the short. And then, I mean, if you go absolutely nuts with it, you can go a little bit higher than that. But then you get into all the other costs of bringing that product to market.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into those in a second. We haven't even touched on, your manufacturing facilities and that, but I have, again, in researching this, I've spoke to other clothing brands, and the numbers that you're telling me here, they line up very, very well. Like I spoke to someone who said that a Xiaomi, depending on where you go for it, the most expensive could be around 7 to 10 euro. A good mid range could be 2 to 3 euro. This person said they had seen a €1 Xiaomi on a pair of bibs that cost over 300 euro. And then they give examples like 3 to 6 euro for bib straps, and similar to what you were saying for leg grippers. And as you have already touched on there, the lycra, the woven or the knitted fabric was kind of the most surprising part to me, in that could be anything up to €9 per meter squared, and each shorts would need like 1.5 meters squared of the fabric. So you're looking well over €10 at that point for the fabrics alone.
Yeah.
Are those, again, you've already said your figures. This person had got to like a manufacturing cost ex factory of like €50, and that seems to line up with what you're saying.
Yeah. And a little bit depends on where you manufacture it as well. Obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah. The one part I would add is that for your standard knit fabrics, you'll top out at 12, 13, generally what we see in shorts. When you get into the stretch wovens, it's pretty easy to double that. So the stretch woven fabrics, to give you a little bit more abrasion resistance, you have a thinner, more compact, more compressive fabric, and also just having less material there helps a little bit with the moisture management. Yeah, going to the stretch wovens is a way to dramatically increase some of those costs.
Again, listeners might be saying, "Oh, that's €50. It's not pennies, but it's still a heck of a lot less than the 350 I paid for my recent bibs or whatever." Well, there is more that goes into it that we will get into. But you mentioned manufacturing, where it's done, and that. I think that now's a good time to get into that. Like, how many Castelli factories is there, and where are they?
Yeah, so most of the products you see from Castelli are completely designed, developed, prototyped, all the pattern making, all of the spec, all the wear testing, everything happens right here at corporate headquarters in the Dolomites. We have 16 people in the sample room. So really from ideation through being ready for production all happens very, very much in-house. And then as we start to go to production, what we actually do is we buy in all of the components, all the fabrics, all of everything down to the chamois, right down to the threads, come to our headquarters. And then we send out for individual production runs everything that's needed to make a production run of a garment. So that starts with the placed patterns. We actually do the placing of the pattern for cutting. We have the sew by sample, and then everything the factory needs to do to make that garment. So we send out that package we work with the major part we do, most of the production we do with 8 factories in Italy and Eastern Europe. And then that factory will actually take the entire kit. They'll lay out the fabric, cut it, sew it together, finish it, and then they send back to us all the finished goods. And these factories have been working with us over a long period of time, and we have our quality control people in there. We have our best standards books of how it's actually to be made according to our standards. So that varies widely from what some brands are doing. A few brands in cycling actually are producing everything in-house. There's some obvious benefits of that, but the downside is that you're really stuck to just what you can make in your own factory. And sometimes we've stayed away from that because we think our model allows us to control all the critical inputs without having the first drive of our business decisions being how can we fill our factory or how can we not exceed factory capacity. So our model leaves us a lot more flexibility on the factory capacity side. And then on the other extreme, you have some brands that are doing a design and then sending off to a factory who's doing all the prototyping, all the developing, all the patterning, is sourcing all of the raw materials, and it's basically, from a design is doing everything right down to sending back the finished garment. So it's really all over the board what's happening in the cycling industry. So we're kind of splitting the middle between the two extremes.
But those factories that, if I heard you correctly there, they're all in Italy or Eastern Europe.
The ones that we use, yeah. We produce some products, especially gloves, shoe covers, a few of the rain jackets we do in Asia. We do custom, not only in Europe, but also in El Salvador for US and Canada. And then we have a factory that we own in the Philippines. So yeah, it's
everywhere.
I think last I checked, I think we had 34 facilities around the world working on all of our brands. But the majority of Castelli Sportful comes through the model I just described.
That's good news for my next question, because I wanted to ask you, how do labor costs vary depending on where your factories are located? Which is a huge question, but
yeah. No, it's kind of insane. They varied, pretty dramatically because your labor costs in, say, Europe or the US are going to be by far the highest. And then it goes down to Eastern Europe. It's increased dramatically over the last decade and a half. It's probably gone up at least fivefold. It's gone up by about fivefold since those economies have continued to grow. And then even in Asia and China, China used to be absolutely, shockingly cheap, but the average salary in China is increased dramatically as the economy has developed.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of brands move away from China, going to Bangladesh, Myanmar, other places for that very reason, I understand.
Yeah. Although it's that moving out of these places is kind of difficult, because not only do the factories and the skills of the factories develop, but the whole ecosystem of suppliers grows up around these factories. And so to jump from China, that's extremely well developed in terms of kind of everything you would want to do, to go into some of these really developing markets. Okay, you can get cheap labor, but it's labor is a little bit less experienced, and then you still have to import all of the components and the factories, or the fabrics, to the factory. So it's not quite as easy as just like sending the order to a new factory and hoping things turn out right.
You can see a white sort of sideboard here to my side, and that's my cycling kit dresser. Don't worry, it's bigger than just two drawers there. You can only see two. But I just, as you were speaking, reached across and grabbed the first Castelli thing I found, which happened to be Espresso Bib tights. And I grabbed a pair of Sportful tights also. My winter kit is near at hand these days, as we're still working through. But both of them say made in Italy on the label. Does that actually mean these are fully made in Italy? The factory that puts them together is in Italy?
Yeah, it's actually, there's kind of a funny thing, because the label that we put in the garment, always the market where, or the country where the thing was actually stitched together. For customs purposes, there's the most convoluted system that you can imagine, where we have to actually go to the origin of the yarn that was used to make the fabric. So we could have a yarn that was made in China, comes to Italy to be put into a fabric that's then dyed. One of our big fabric suppliers will knit in Italy and dye in Hungary. And then all the different components, we have to figure out where the majority of the costing has come from. And so from a customs standpoint, there's actually different rules for it. It's kind of insane.
That's something I hadn't considered, but something we're, I think, also going to get into later on in the show. What I wanted to ask you about that made in Italy, that you've highlighted there, European labor is not the cheapest, nor should labor be cheap anywhere, but it is not the cheapest in Europe. You'd mentioned also the specific sort of opportunities that China offers, and that it has that network in place. Why then choose to make these in Italy if it's...
Yeah, so maybe I'll address this first from a why do we choose to make in Europe. On the fabric side, which is obviously a big driver of what we do, especially Italian, but also French, Spanish, even into Portugal, some of these mills that used to be, pretty big mills supplying a bigger industry production. As a lot of the general clothing manufacturing has moved to Asia, a lot of these mills have become very specialized on doing very, very technical products that are lower volume, a little bit higher price. But obviously there's Asian suppliers that make some amazing fabrics, but generally the Asian suppliers are focused on bigger volume stuff, or stuff like Zara that we talked about before. And with some of these Italian suppliers, we can do things we could never develop in Asia just because the volumes aren't there. And, for an Italian supplier, we're a very, very important customer, whereas in Asia we'd be one of many. So, almost all the fabrics that you see that we use are being made in Europe. So with the fabrics already here, it becomes less cost competitive if you take the fabrics, send them to Asia to be made into a finished goods, and then send them back. And it also dramatically increases the production time, because you got to calculate in transport both ways. And if you're shipping that by air, then it actually is more expensive to make it in Asia than it would be to do in Europe. And then with the system we have now, also, if you go to China, they're looking for a minimum order of at least 1,000 pieces every time they produce an item. Whereas we can produce in lower quantities, since we have all the fabrics here. We can be a lot closer to the market and produce to demand, which also I think it plays into sustainability, that we don't have to just speculate and produce a huge quantity that may not really get sold the way we hoped it would. We can more react to futures orders that we get from retailers.
Is there anything more premium about a factory in Europe, or what makes a premium factory? I'm assuming you can have a premium factory anywhere, but is it like just better lighting and higher wages, or what? Yeah. What major quality impacts have you got there?
Yeah, so it's hard to say really that one country is going to be automatically better than another. You can have a great factory in Bangladesh, you could have a bad factory in Italy and Germany, and so a lot of it's just the skills of the workers, how it's managed, but also the input from the brand. Because if we want to make something as cheap as we can, then that factory has to be humming. They've got to be super efficient. They got to be super fast at producing things, and there reaches a point where to be fast, you kind of lose control of some of the precision that we need to make a quality garment.
I'm wondering though, like you mentioned earlier about you do the prototyping, the R&D, the initial prototypes in-house there. How much work is there, and then communicating to factory floor staff how to produce because when you're talking about especially aero clothing, the exact placement of every little detail matters quite a bit. Like, how challenging is that, and how much complexity and cost does that add?
Yeah, so when in the development process should come out there's a jig basically of this is the exact position that it goes into. And so a lot of that work is just making it so that it's harder to mess up. So conveying that, and then there's always the technical information that goes with that production run is very, very, very detailed. And then there's even a sample of what the finished garment should look like that the factory can actually refer to. And then we also have our production people and quality control people in the factories too. So there's multiple levels of redundancy to try to make sure that we get exactly the product that we think we should. It doesn't always happen perfectly.
Yeah, well, I mean, that kind of gets us on to like QC and quality control. Like, if you got a percentage of production runs that typically fail QC, or have you got a target, and what happens to the kit that doesn't meet that target, and how much cost is all that at?
Yeah, so our defect rate is just south of 0.5%. So each production run goes through QC at the factory, and then when it comes back to our headquarters in our warehouse in Italy, it gets checked for QC again, of course, on a sample basis. So, depending upon the garment, we're doing a representative sample. Then if we see defects above a certain level, we'll do more. And then sometimes it'll be 100% checking every single garment in there. And then some of those, when you do have QC issues, some of the time you can repair it. And then, if there's nothing to do, then it goes into to be destroyed.
Presumably that adds cost. That has to be shared amongst everything you sell, I guess.
Yeah, that initial QC check, it's about 0.5%. The amount of stuff that gets it's called C graded. So the stuff that has to be destroyed is pretty small. It doesn't have a significant impact.
Just like the pockets are on the front or something, or
yeah. I mean, it's something that it's usually something that is a total surprise.
It just cannot be used.
It kind of gets missed all the way through. Yeah. Like we've had the cases where maybe it's a fabric we've been using for years, but there's just a batch of fabric that produce it up like we've always done. And then there's, for some reason, it doesn't perform like it does or like it should. But actually we saw a lot more of this during COVID because the fabric suppliers had difficulty in getting their raw yarns. And so even though the yarns are generally graded to kind of standard spec, a fabric supplier might not be able to get the yarn he usually uses, so he switches over to another supplier. And it looks the same, it tests the same, but then you get into the finished garment and somehow it's different. We saw this, we had very limited number, but of chamois during COVID that something was different in the foam. We were never able to actually trace it back to where it came from, but the foam didn't have the same durability like we usually do.
And that's kind of interesting because, as I was saying earlier, like you could find a €1 chamois and a €300 pair of bibs, and that I'm not saying that's from Castelli or Sportful, but is there a way that a consumer could identify such cost saving measures? And if you're saying that you could maybe not spot something in the chamois, maybe it's not all that easy.
Yeah, I think I could spot that €1 chamois, yes, but it would be hard to give the guidelines to the listeners.
Perhaps here's a question: like, is it a case of the more features and indentations and all manner of things on a chamois, the more expensive it is? Because I found that doesn't always mean they're better.
No. In fact, in my opinion, it's like usually too many features is actually a bad thing. It's like, I don't know, my private parts like smoother things, but yeah, it's more of the materials, and then how a chamois is constructed can vary dramatically. Like the Castelli X2 chamois is, when you look at it from the inside, it looks extremely simple, but there's a separate piece because you're looking at just the skincare layer, which is separate from the cushioning layer, which is stitched in. So essentially with our top end shorts, we're stitching in two chamois completely separately. So there's not only the cost of the initial chamois, but also the construction process will affect the total cost of putting that chamois in the short.
All right. Well, it's me again, the voice that you didn't want to hear because it means you've reached the end of the free episode. Yes, if you wanted to keep listening to this one, you need to be a member of Escape Collective and you need to be on our member feed of the podcast or listening direct from escapecollective.com. Ronan, what are they missing out on from here on out?
Well, Dave, that kind of depends on where exactly we cut this episode, which I'm not exactly sure of yet, but we definitely, in the latter half of this episode, we get into some of the hidden costs that manufacturers incur in producing kit. We also get into some of the sponsorships and some of the costs that goes into World Tour teams, private individuals, privateers, and then we sort of wrap it up with a bit of a discussion about how the likes of Temu and that can have kit at such incredibly low prices, and why Castelli doesn't just offer something at that price point. And Steve sort of goes into why he thinks it is possible to buy kit that cheaply, and why that might not be a good thing. And then he does answer why Castelli can't do that. Which, I thought was all very interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah. Anyway, for those that are on the free feed, please consider supporting Escape Collective and get access to unique content like this. Yeah. So anyway, if that's as far as we make it, thanks for tuning in. But hope you keep listening soon.
This episode was produced, edited, and mixed by Will Jones at Red Bricks Media.